Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Andrew Mackenzie Gospel. Andrew has been a research scientist in the weed science with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Charlottetown Research and Development Center since 2016. Andrew obtained his Bachelor of Ecology from Trenton University and his PhD in weed science from the University of Guelph. He studies novel weed management tactics, cover crops, and weed ecology for cropping systems in Atlantic Canada. Andrew regularly provides presentations at producer and industry events and field days, and has authored and co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed manuscripts on cover crops, weed biology, and integrated weed management. In addition to his research activities, he interacts with the public and conservation groups to provide advice and promote sustainable weed management. In his spare time, Andrew enjoys camping, hiking, and spending time with his growing family. And because of his growing family is increasing today, with the arrival of their third child, Andrew will be unable to attend in person, but has kindly recorded his presentation for us this morning. So we'll look at Andrew's presentation.
Thank you. So my name is Andrew Mackenzie Gospel, and I'm a weed scientist with AAFC based here in Charlottetown. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of our Living Labs work that we've been working on the last couple of years, looking at the effects of various soil building practices, specifically manure and cover cropping, on weed seed bank dynamics within potato rotation. And I just want to thank my co-authors here, Sherry Fillmore, for doing a lot of statistical analyses, as well as Judith Ierodiza, who really leads this project. Now, I don't need to tell you, but Atlantic Canada grows a heck of a lot of potatoes. So within Canada, the annual farm gate value of potatoes is about $1.2 billion, which makes it the most economically important horticulture crop to Canada. Of that, 36% of the acreage is seeded here in Atlantic Canada, primarily in Prince Edward Island as well as New Brunswick. And in our region, potatoes are one of the most economically important crops to our producers. However, potato producers in our region face numerous challenges. So here in your top left, we're just looking at productivity of our field. So we're looking at Prince Edward Island in blue, as well as Alberta in red, an area where potato acreage continues to increase. And going back over the last 40 years, you can see that while Alberta seems to be on really a sloping upward trend in terms of productivity, i.e. the average hundredweight harvested per acre planted, whereas in Prince Edward Island, we're at a much slower pace of increase on our productivity. So not necessarily stagnating yields, but not really climbing at the same rate as some other areas. And there's a whole myriad of reasons for this, one of which is my colleague Judith has documented in a couple years ago, declines in soil organic matter. So this is one of her papers looking at 6 cycles of a 3-year rotation, where they documented close to 1% decline in organic matter every decade. As well, potatoes are very intensive. They require a lot of inputs, and the combination of our sandy soils as well as unpredictable and intense precipitation events can lead to nitrate leaching as well as pesticide leaching into some of our water courses. So I'm a weed scientist, so I focus most of my time on pest management, and pesticide resistance as well as just pest pressures in general will continue to be an issue. So whether that's wireworm or Colorado potato beetle, either being challenged to control or resistant to many of the tactics we have, as well as the diseases, we have no sprays that will completely prevent diseases. They're really just a protectant to prevent them from setting hold, as well as what my lab has been documenting the last couple of years is an increase in incidence of herbicide resistance within potato production, where we estimate within Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, almost 50% of fields have either common lamp spores or red root pig resistant to photosystem 2 inhibitors, which is the most commonly used product in potato production in our area. So we have all of these issues affecting our producers. So what do we do about it? Well, this has led to the development of what's called the Living Labs Initiative. And right here, Prince Edward Island, we're the pioneer site, one of the very first sites of this whole suite of projects that have been launched across the country. And now with moving over to our next phase, the ACS, or Agroclimate Solutions, we have one of these sites, at least one of these sites in each one of our provinces across Canada. Here you're looking at the Living Labs Atlantic site. So we have 3 main watersheds where we're doing a lot of our work, either in the Surrey Management Watershed, Kensington North, or the Dunk River Watershed, as well as in the center there you can see our experimental farm where we have some experiments happening as well. Now, the whole point of the Living Labs initiative, it's not to just continue to do more research as we have always done it, about co-development. And that co-development process is to try to accelerate adoption. So all participants are engaged in all components and all aspects of the development of that project. And the whole point is to validate our BMPs, our best management practices, in real life scenarios. So we're not necessarily developing novel or new BMPs, but just testing them out within producers' fields to show them within their production system how these best management practices can work. And this is done within those producer settings to accelerate adoption, as well as to build trust between the researcher and the producers to try and further accelerate that adoption and co-development process moving forward. So that co-development process, it's a long time. We're currently working through the next iteration of this project, moving over to Living Labs 2.0. And going back to our first Living Lab, our producers identified 13 best management practices that they'd be interested in, all within two broad areas. So one is enhancing soil health to deal with that declining soil organic matter that we talked about, as well as projects looking at reducing losses of agricultural inputs, whether that be fertilizer as well as pesticides. So we have all of these BMPs broadly grouped in these two areas, and here you're just looking at a chart saying yes or no whether or not these various BMPs will affect either soil health, nitrate losses, or pesticide losses. Now, one of those BMPs is the use of cover crops. Annual cover cropping, that is cover crops going for a full year prior to a main cash crop, are becoming increasingly adopted in Atlantic Canada, primarily to combat declines in that soil health as well as soil erosion. And we've done quite a bit of work on cover crops, selecting which cover crop might do best within our conditions, as well as identifying which ones are most productive. Now, another soil building practice we can use is the application of various soil amendments, and here we're looking at manure application. And manure application can increase soil health as well as soil end supply to our potatoes, so within that rotation, to ultimately reduce the reliance on synthetic fertilizers, which can be particularly prone to nitrate leaching. So we have these two soil building practices looking at trying to build soil health through the addition of cover crops and soil amendments to try and reduce the amount of nitrate leaching or nitrogen losses, as well as improve our soil health. So we wanted to know, how does manure application and cover cropping alter weed seed bank dynamics? Now, it's always assumed that manure has weed seeds in it. Shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. However, few studies have actually investigated the impact that manure application is going to have on the weed seed bank. We know we're adding weed seeds to our system. However, is there any kind of negative impact of the addition of those weed seeds in that manure? So, very few studies have actually empirically tested whether or not manure application will increase the number of weed seed banks and weed pressure going through at that full rotation. Next, cover crops can reduce the number of weed seeds returned to that seed bank by direct competition. So when we seed our crop, we get some weeds emerging up along with our cover crop, and hopefully the idea is that cover crop will strongly compete with those weeds and prevent them from setting seed, ultimately outcompeting. So you're just getting a drawdown on that seed bank. So you're removing a whole bunch of weed seeds without getting a new return or new flush of weed seeds being added back to the seed bank. If we look at the distribution of weed seeds within the soil profile, here this is just some data some unpublished data from my lab, looking at going down throughout the soil horizon. And so if you want to look on your left here, these are 5 centimeter sections going down in the soil. So you can see that over half of our weed seeds are concentrated in that top 5 centimeters of soil. So if we can help exhaust that reserve through cover cropping, as well as reduce tillage, which we'll talk about in a second, then we can go a long way to preventing the new buildup of fresh weed seeds. Here on the left here, looking at, this is that same fields, but after a year of fallowing. So we're just looking at that top 5 centimeters of soil. And so we went from approximately 3,000 seeds or 3,200 seeds per liter of soil up to over 20,000 seeds. So really, a tenfold increase in the amount of weed seeds that are within that soil profile when we don't do anything. So to prevent that, we can incorporate things like cover crops to try and help go a long way to exhausting that seed bank, upper layer seed bank. Now, reduced tillage in crop rotation can also promote declines in seed bank density. So we talked about that top layer of soil containing most of the weed seeds. This is we get to that stale seedbed technique that you might be familiar with, where we encourage the growth and the germination of that top layer and then reduce the amount of soil disturbance so that we're preventing mixing of that soil to bring new weed seeds that are lower down in the profile but still viable back up to the top. And lastly, soil amendments such as manure application can in fact alter crop weed competition dynamics. So our cover crops, or while our manure may add weed seeds to our soil, our cover crops are going to actively compete with them, and that manure application may interact with our cover crops to either enhance crop competition or enhance weed competition. So this is just a nice little graphic from a review paper on soil amendments, effects on crop weed competition. And here we can end up with a couple different scenarios. So we've got our weeds here in in fuchsia, and our crop in purple. And so your soil amendment can either favor your crop, resulting in increased crop growth and actively suppressing weeds, or it can favor both crops and weeds, and then you end up with essentially, it washes out. Or the manure application can favor weed growth, and therefore our weeds come to dominate over top of our canopy, or they can have species-specific effects, where in some cases they favor the crop, that's down in scenario 4, in some cases they favor specific weed species. All right, so we asked ourselves, how does manure application and cover cropping alter weed seed bank dynamics? So to do this, we used a 3-year crop rotation, that is a continuation of Judith's rotation that she's been conducting at Harrington for the last couple of years, where we have a mix of annual perennial grasses and legumes, all seeded in 2019. Now these mostly include barley that is underseeded with various perennial grasses and legumes, as well as we have some very commonly used forages that would be grown within our rotation, such as barley, underseed, red clover. In 2019, we seeded all of our crops and as well as applied manure at a rate of 20 tons per hectare of pen-pack cattle manure. And then in 2020, we allowed forage to regrow, and a couple of our cover crops we reseeded to either sorghum, followed by brown mustard, sorghum sudan grass, or pearl millet. And then in 2021, we seeded potato. In 2019 and 2020, we collected cover crop and weed biomass, and then in 2021, we collected potato yield. Now, I'm not going to be talking about weed biomass in 2021 as we used herbicides, so there was really no differences between any of our treatments. We collected seed bank cores in the spring prior to emergence of anything and after all seeding operations, so we're trying to capture what is the potential emergence of weed seeds within that system from the start of the year. We used repeated measures analysis to investigate the effects of manure and cover cropping on weed pressure in the seed bank, as well as nonlinear regression and multivariate analysis to look at relationships between cover crop biomass, weed seed bank density, and diversity, and weed pressure in season. Results, we found that overall manure application did not increase weed pressure. So here we're looking at weed biomass within all of our cover crop treatments as well as our bare soil control. And we've got our no manure treatments in orange and our manure treatments in green. And this is data averaged over 2019 and 2020. We didn't see any impact or effective year across here on weed biomass, but in general, no increase in weed biomass from manure application. Now I will mention we also didn't see an increase in cover crop biomass for manure application. So it doesn't look like, at least at our time frame when we collected this data, which was in the start of August, we didn't notice any difference in biomass production between our cover crops or our weeds from manure application. There were differences amongst our cover crops, where some of our more aggressive grasses and fast-growing grasses tended, and perennials tended to result in greater weed suppression than some of our annual species. Now moving over into the seed bank, which is really what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. So not surprisingly, manure application added weed seeds to the soil. So by adding manure to our fields, we added approximately between 15 and 30,000 seeds per square meter in that rhizosphere soil. And so here we've got our weed seed bank density on the y-axis, and through time on the x-axis. We've got our no manure on our left and our manure on our right. Now, we didn't see any interaction between our cover crop treatments and manure, so they all seem to respond more or less in the same way. What I'd like you to focus on is that when we look at our manure side versus our no manure side, is that all those lines in the manure side trend downwards, except for one, which is our bare soil control, which trends upwards. So even though we're adding weed seeds to our system for manure application, as we go through time, at the end of the cycle in 2021, we saw no difference between our two treatments in terms of weed seed bank density. So we're adding weed seeds with our manure, but something's happening, either intense competition from our cover crops, but it's not resulting in a carryover of additional weed seeds within our system, especially when we get to potato. Digging in a little bit here, this is just looking at our seed bank density of total grass weed seeds versus broadleaf weed seeds. We've got our grass seeds on our left and our broadleaf seeds on our right. And we saw no interaction, again, manure application here, looking at effects on broadleaf or grasses amongst our different cover crop groups, either annual perennials or annual perennials. But we saw some interesting differences between the effect of cover cropping on grass weed seeds versus broadleaf seeds. So here we've got in our annual system, our grass weeds, we had a whole lot of them in 2019, but our annual cover crops were able to drastically reduce the amount of grass weed seeds in our seed bank within just 1 year. Compare that to our perennial system here, and we do get a bit of a reduction, but it's not as great of a reduction as our annuals. So it appears that annual cover cropping may be more effective on some of our grass weed seeds. Compare that over here on our broadleaves, and you can see that our annual cover crops didn't really have any impact on annual broadleaf weed seed bank. But some of our perennials did seem to have an impact and reduced the number of weed seeds, or broadleaf weed seeds, following perennial cover cropping. And then that green bar, that's that 2021 year. Now this is the year that we went and applied tillage to prep for potato. You can see that in terms of broadleaf weed seeds, it just brings everything back up, and all that soil mixing probably results in a lot of those differences being washed out. But we can still see an effect over here on our grass weed seeds. Jumping into our two most common species within our data set, we have green foxtail and common lamb's quarters, our most common grass and most common broadleaf, and we see the exact same trend that we just discussed. So our annual cover crops seem to allow for some suppression of our grass weeds compared to our perennial cover crops, whereas our perennial cover crops, or in terms of lamb's quarters, our annual cover crops were more effective at suppressing lamb's quarter density. I mentioned we just want to briefly mention the effect of weed diversity. So in addition to adding weed seeds to our soil, manure application increased the number of species in our system. So we went from about 6.5, 7 species in our weed seed bank up to around 10 by adding manure. That's just in that first year. Once you get to the next year, there's no differences in weed species richness in that seed bank. And we did a little bit of PCA analysis to look at relationships between weed biomass, seed bank density, and diversity. And what I want you to focus on here is the angle between weed biomass here and seed bank density here. Now, because those are perpendicular to each other, that indicates no correlation. So regardless of whatever that seed bank density was, weed biomass in season seemed to have the seed bank density seemed to have no impact on weed biomass in season. Compare that to some of our diversity metrics of that seed bank, and increased evenness, so that's increased diversity and evenness amongst our population, so not dominance by single species, tended to be negatively associated with weed biomass. So when these arrows go in opposite directions, it indicates a negative correlation. So more diverse weed seed bank and even weed seed bank was correlated with lower weed biomass. So that increase in weed species richness from manure application up front may have driven or resulted in less weed biomass in season, and therefore less weed seed being returned back to our soil, and potentially why we see those reductions occurring quite rapidly following manure application. So in addition to the increase in diversity potentially contributing to a reduction in weed seed bank density from manure application, We also saw that manure changed the relationship between cover crop biomass and weed biomass. So I mentioned that while we didn't see any increase in cover crop biomass from manure application, we did see an increase in weed suppressive ability. So here we've got our cover crops with manure application in orange and no manure in green, and see that we get a classic response where as we increase cover crop biomass, we increase the amount of weed suppression. That would be expected, but cover crop biomass the manure application modulates this response, whereby you get an increase in weed suppression for each unit of cover crop biomass by adding manure. So we're making our cover crops more weed suppressive from manure application, suggesting we may fit into one of those scenarios where we are in fact favoring our crop. So while we didn't detect any differences between cover crop biomass in our manure versus no manure application, it could be we just missed this. It could have, those differences may have manifested earlier on in, more rapid canopy closure, fall manure application versus no manure application, and we simply just missed that measurement. Adding manure did not increase weed pressure in our system. Manure increased initial weed seed bank density and richness, but this effect declined through time. And increased seed bank richness was associated with decreased weed biomass in season. And adding manure increased the competitive ability of our cover crops. So manure may provide that initial boost to cover crop growth, allowing for that early season weed suppression. As well, we didn't get into it too much, but nutrient availability is altered by manure application, which may have species-specific effects on our weed community. Now, manure application increases soil N supply to potato. As well, manure can increase cover crop biomass, therefore increase weed suppression. Now, the provision of agri-ecosystem services is tightly correlated to cover crop biomass productivity. And if we can increase the amount of biomass being produced by our cover crops through manure application, not only are we increasing the amount of weed suppression provided, but we're increasing, potentially adding carryover effects to other agri-ecosystem services that we're looking for out of our cover crops, whether that's scavenging nutrients or building soil organic matter. And lastly, in the absence of herbicides, cover crops can provide a carryover effect, decreasing weed pressure in subsequent seasons. If we can have an effect on that weed seed bank and result in a greater drawdown on that weed seed bank, we can reduce the amount of weeds that potentially can emerge in any given year. So apply manure, grow competitive cover crops to build resiliency in our cropping systems. These manure application and cover crops can be important tools for producers to not only increase soil organic matter, reduce soil erosion, but also reduce the reliance on synthetic fertilizers and herbicides. So if increased compatibility of cover crops by manure application can increase the rate of seed bank decline and overcome that initial addition to the weed seed bank. So if I were to wrap up this entire work in one sentence, it would be, don't be scared of the weed seeds in manure. So thank you for taking the time. I apologize that I can't be there, but my information is there up on the slide, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Feel free to reach out by email or by phone. As I said, I apologize for not being able to be there. So thank you.